Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for coming along. My name's Xanthi Ashburner and I work with the Centre for the History of Emotions at UQ. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and paying respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm really pleased to be welcoming you to this afternoon's panel discussion about the legacy of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, which was published in 1818, so it's 200 years old this year. The idea for this event was first put to me last year by my friends Jenny, who's on the panel, and Aurelia Armstrong, who pointed out that it was very fortuitous that the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein was falling in the same year that GOMA was doing a major retrospective of works by Patricia Piccinini. Of course, Patricia's work engages many of the same themes as Frankenstein, themes like maternity and creation, empathy and hybridity, and our kinship with the monstrous and the non-human. This afternoon, I'm really pleased to be welcoming Patricia back to Brisbane and to the gallery to talk a bit about these resonances with our other speakers. Patricia, thanks so much for joining us. We're so happy. I'm also delighted to welcome Moira Gatens, who's Challis Professor of Philosophy at the University of Sydney, and this morning gave a really terrific lecture on Frankenstein in the context of the exhibition. So here to respond to Moira's lecture and to the topic of Shelley's legacy and Patricia's work more generally are my terrific colleagues from UQ, Dr. Lisa O'Connell, could you guys just wave? Dr. Lisa O'Connell, Dr. Jennifer Clement, Dr. Karin Sellberg and Associate Professor Elizabeth Stevens. Between them, our speakers represent a lot of different interests and areas of expertise within the humanities. They come from literary studies, philosophy, cultural studies, and they work on topics like the 18th century novel, feminist theory, histories of the body, and the relation between art and science. So our event this afternoon will have three parts. First, our speakers will give brief presentations about different aspects of Shelley's legacy and Frankenstein. Then Moira will open a discussion amongst the panellists that will run for about a half an hour, and then finally we'll turn things over to you guys to sort of share your thoughts on this topic. And we will have a sort of collaborative discussion together. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lisa, our first speaker.
I'm really excited to be part of this panel. I'm going to flip, that's me, that's my title, Frankenstein, Horror and Sympathy, and this is my first slide. Okay, so I want to begin with two images which set up the dialogue, I think, between horror and sympathy, two rather different emotions that are central to Frankenstein's legacy, particularly Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, because there are many, many iterations of Frankenstein across literary and popular culture. The first is one of the earliest illustrations of Frankenstein's monster, Theodore von Holst's frontispiece, from the 1831 revised edition of Frankenstein. This image depicts the novel's seminal moment, the awakening of the creature and Victor Frankenstein fleeing in fear and disgust at his own creation. There was a quotation from the text included as an epigraph for this frontispiece. The quotation went, "By the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive agitation seized its limbs. I rushed out of the room." So this is a kind of primal scene of bad parenting. The creature there in the foreground is depicted much as he's described in the novel, with a shock of black hair, preternaturally large body, surrounded by the paraphernalia of death and memento mori. Victor is a picture of fear and loathing. He's backward-looking, wide-eyed, making a very hurried exit. The image is much admired for the dramatic way in which it renders a defining conflict of the novel, the simultaneity of the creature's birth and Victor's rejection of him. Yet, even as we see the conflict and melodrama of this scene, we can also pick up on the doubling and identification going on between the two figures depicted, Frankenstein and his monster, creature and creator. We can notice the visual repetitions here, most obviously Each figure has luxuriant black hair, a shocked stare, a kind of rictus smile or grimace. Their bodies are in motion and rendered on a continual diagonal plane, etc., etc. So I think von Holst pays tribute to a recurring motif of the novel, an uncanny doubling and blurring of distinctions between creature and creator, a relation of identification or deep connection between Victor Frankenstein and his monster. So much so that many of us, in our sort of received versions of Frankenstein, think that the monster is Frankenstein. Now that's a mistake, but it points to a deliberate confusion of man and monster and a merging of sympathy and horror that's central to Mary Shelley's project, I think. Okay, a second image. From Curious Affection. This is Patricia Piccinini's The Bond of 216. There's a nice contrast with von Holst here, of course. We're moving from shock and horror to the kind of warmth and sympathy immediately evoked by the mother-baby bond. There are echoes of the Madonna here. The relationship between parent and child here is not a relation of spectacular rejection, tension or conflict, but one of intense intimacy and care. That much is obvious. But there's a kind of continuity here too, a sort of doubling again between creature and creator. Partly through the sensual touch, contact of mother and child, they share flesh, folds, curves, partly through the formal repetition and melding of their bodies, which suggests not just care and affection, but a deeper symbiotic bond, perhaps. There's a lot more that could be said about this image, of course, but I'm going to race ahead and just consolidate a bit here just to say that von Holst and Piccinini are presenting here scenarios of good and bad parenting, of primal horror on the one hand and a sort of primal sympathy on the other. And at the very same time, we can see the doubling and interplay between creature and creator present in both. Now, for me, these two images underscore Mary Shelley's double legacy of shock and sympathy. Excuse me. How does that legacy work? Well, we're very familiar, I think, with the horror side of that legacy, the shock and horror side. We can look to Frankenstein's extraordinary afterlife in modern popular culture, and in particular in film, where the creature features as an object of horror and sensation, usually an occasion for novel special effects within new forms of film technology and so on. I can offer you three very quick examples. Likely they're very familiar to you. And each, of course, emphasises the visuality of the monster, his spectacular, objectified monstrosity. So here's Shelley's monster, present at the dawn of cinema. This is Edison's kinetogram of 1910, very, very early film, with the monster represented as a kind of atavistic, primitive, loping creature. The monster is there, of course, at the birth of classic Hollywood genre cinema too, especially the B-grade horror flick. This is the Universal Pictures production of Frankenstein from 1931, directed by James Whale, starring Boris Karloff, of course. This is considered a masterpiece of the horror genre and a kind of queer masterpiece as well. This is still perhaps the most enduring image of the monster as a creature of the laboratory, a man-machine, a kind of cyborg, a monstrous hybrid, his head bolted to his body. I'll just run through a couple of more contemporary iterations. Here's the monster again, in the 1990s this time, as an object of new digital special effects, in particular CGI, computer-generated imagery that was extremely novel and appealing at the time. This is Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein of 1994. And the image is, of course, Robert De Niro as the monster, grotesque, malevolent, confrontational, staring us right in the eye, evoking a kind of horror. I should have probably apologise for the next couple of slides. I would have edited these out. Certainly they continue the horror trajectory. If we needed any proof of the contemporary bite and currency of the Frankenstein myth and its ongoing horror effects, this is what you get when you Google Trump and Frankenstein. Trumpenstein. Maybe it's fitting that on the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein, we find the creature alive and well as the leader of the free world. Okay, so I don't know what's next. Good, okay, to sympathy. We need to shift gear here and move away from sensational horror, the sensational horror and visuality of pop Frankenstein, and we need to go back to the text itself. Mary Shelley placed the monster's story at the heart of her narrative. It was framed in multiple and very complicated ways, but it nonetheless took up a good 20% of the text. By far the most radical thing about her novel was that she let the monster speak for himself. He's no angel, but nor is he the mute creature or imbecile of the horror tradition. He's highly eloquent and persuasive. What does he say? Let me summarise. After his abandonment by Victor, his creator, he takes shelter, and he tells us that he learns language, reads books, and becomes acquainted with human history. And on this basis, he begins to engage in self-reflection. Most importantly, he puts two and two together and concludes that he's got the rough end of the stick. One is not born a monster, he effectively says. One becomes one by virtue of dispossession and abuse, which is effectively what he's telling us here. I am malicious, he tells Victor, because I am lonely and miserable, shunned and hated by all mankind. The creature's indictment of Victor, his abandonment, Victor's abandonment and abuse, effective abuse of the monster, his bad parenting, if you will, is of course an indictment of society as a whole, a society that has turned its back on the poor, failed the weak, the vulnerable, and the disenfranchised, a society that blames and fears its own victims and pours contempt upon the marginalised and the dispossessed. The monster's story is utterly convincing, touching to the last degree. Next slide. Victor, like the reviewer quoted here from Knight's Quarterly, a contemporary review magazine, is convinced. On the basis of the undeniable truth and justice of the monster's cause, the monster goes on to make an impassioned claim to love, companionship, and community as a human right, if you like, human in inverted commas there. Make me a mate, he says, a female monster, a sympathetic partner. You must create a female for me with whom I can live in interchange of those sympathies necessary for my being. Victor reluctantly agrees before going on to abandon his promise, setting the monster on a path of despair and even more terrible revenge. So in Shelley's novel, monster love, sexuality, monster family, and monster community is a path not taken. These are human privileges that the monster claims, but ultimately is not granted. Here, I think, we reach the limits of sympathy, at least for Shelley and her readership in 1818. Now, Victor's rationale for denying the monster his just request is pretty simple. He says, what if I make a female monster, but she doesn't like him? What if she rejects him too? What if she does like him even? And then they breed a kind of race of monster demons who will threaten humankind. Excuse me. So once again, I think we can turn to pop culture for one understanding of where the narrative of monster spawn, if you like, actually leads. This question is, of course, taken up with relish in B-movie land, particularly, and within the familiar contours of the horror genre that we all know so well. And so it is that we have not just the original Frankenstein pick, but that Universal Studios end up running a whole kind of series of sequels. The Bride of Frankenstein, I've got that here, yes. The Son of Frankenstein, The House of Frankenstein, etc., etc. Now, just a few slides to whiz through here on this question. Here is The Bride of Frankenstein. This is a pretty awful reproduction, I think. I can't really tell from your point of view, but it was on my screen. But I love this long shot because it renders the female monster's birth as a kind of wedding tableau. And then here, in the mid-shot, we can see that the groom, Boris Karloff, is really, really happy. But the bride, Elsa Lanchester, is not so sure. Horror and sympathy collide here in a spectacular kind of way. Not so in The Couple, one of Patricia's pieces in Curious Affection. Again, this is actually a photograph by me, so it's not a particularly good reproduction of this piece, forgive me. But the point here is that the pleasure and the sexuality of the monster in this instance isn't something lurid, sensational and alarming or horrifying, but something ordinary, mundane and unremarkable, as cued by the wonderful sort of immersive realist context here, the down-home setting of their embrace. We're in a slightly retro camper van. It's familiar, inviting, sort of homely, at least to me. Excuse me. Here we have a gentle, hyper-real couple, and I think in this piece we're inside the kind of pathos and identification and poignancy that sympathy invites. Okay, now the rest of my slides actually make the same point. Here we have more of the kind of wonderful movie posters from that Universal Studios era of B-grade horror, and these are various versions of The Bride of Frankenstein, The Son of Frankenstein, and here we have The House of Frankenstein, where all the monsters get together. From Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, Dracula, Hunchback, Mad Doctor, etc. Okay, I think that's, yes, I'm going to go here and simply say that as a kind of conclusion, that I think finally, in the context of the art world, which has been, after all, for so long under the spell of modernism and high culture, we see the two aspects of Mary Shelley's legacy that I've been talking about, horror and sympathy, very often dismissed in the context of contemporary art. Horror, because it's so lowbrow after all, belongs to trashy pop culture, sensationalism, cheap thrills, etc. We're familiar with that kind of attitude. Sympathy, because of its raw emotionalism, I think, its emphasis on human feeling, is deeply embarrassing in the context of the art world, often dismissed as sentimental. Can't get worse than that. So, insofar as much of the contemporary art world is sort of allergic to shock and sympathy, I think Patricia's work offers us an interesting kind of challenge. It channels some of the radical sympathy of Mary Shelley's legacy. And I'd argue some of the radical ambivalence that surrounds the monster's story. And it's still, for us, really quite uncertain implications for the boundaries and the categories of identity through which we live. Okay, thank you.
Hello. I'm here to talk about metamorphosis. And to that extent, I'm really not talking exactly about Mary Shelley's legacy, or to be more precise, I'm talking about a legacy that began a long time before Mary Shelley was born or thought of. So I'm starting with an image that will be familiar to, I think, nearly everyone here, which is, of course, Patricia's sculpture of teenage metamorphosis, which is, I think, a very benign sculpture for such a problematic topic in many ways, if I recall my brother's teenage years, for example. Not mine, of course. I was the good one. I just want that to be clear. What caught my eye here, as a literature person, as you might imagine, is that Patricia gives her teenager a copy of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis and Other Stories, which is very appropriate. Kafka's story, The Metamorphosis, is, among other things, of course, the story of the destruction of one life and the birth of another, kind of through that process of destruction, and, of course, through the process of bodily change into what appears to be a cockroach, a man-sized cockroach. And this makes it, of course, very much like the stories of metamorphosis that I want to discuss as a Renaissance scholar, Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is, of course, one of Kafka's sources for his study. Now, the Metamorphoses of Ovid tell endless, seemingly endless stories of origins, creation, and transformation as people are turned into animals or stones or trees, and stones are turned into people, and so forth and so on. Although Ovid was an ancient Roman writer, he became enormously influential in the English Renaissance, and that's a connection for me as a Renaissance scholar. Ovid keeps cropping up all the time. You can't get away from him. And a lot of the reason for that is because the writers of the Renaissance recognized Ovid as a writer for whom creation is always recreation. Okay, you never start with nothing. You always start with something in the beginning. And so these English Renaissance writers took Ovid as their model as they thought themselves about what artistic creation means and the sorts of dangers that it poses. So I'm going to give you one of Ovid's stories very quickly here, the story of Pygmalion. So Pygmalion is a man of royalty, actually, but he's also an artist, and he's disgusted with the local women. He just thinks they're utter pigs, basically, not to put too fine a line on it. And so instead of directing his libido towards these horrible, horrible women, he instead sculpts a beautiful, beautiful sculpture of a pure, virginal woman. I mean, she's stone, so, the question of her virginity is moot, really, but clearly in his mind, she is a virgin. And he falls in love with this figure because there's no one else as good as this figure whom he creates himself. So he goes to pray to the goddess of love, please send me a bride who will be like my statue, because he doesn't quite dare to name what his actual desire is. Venus, being Venus, knows exactly what he wants. So she causes the statue to come alive as the woman who eventually becomes known as Galatea. Now, this is one of Ovid's very, very few stories to have a more or less happy ending. Generally in Ovid, the endings are sticky at best. But it's not exactly a happy ending, because although, as far as we know, Pygmalion and Galatea end up reasonably happy together, Pygmalion and Galatea's granddaughter, Moira, goes on to fall in love with her own father, seduces him, becomes pregnant by him, is turned into a tree, and hence the term myrrh for a certain kind of tree, and then gives birth to her son, Adonis. So you got it right. She turns into a tree, and then she gives birth. Adonis has his own story, of course. He is an extremely beautiful young man with whom Venus falls in love. And this is sort of interesting because it's like Venus's own actions come back to haunt her. She falls in love with Adonis. Adonis, depending on which version of the story you read, is more or less responsive to her. In some versions, like Shakespeare's, Adonis refuses her attentions altogether, refuses love itself altogether, and is ultimately gored by a boar in his hunting. He dies and is turned into a flower. My point about this story, among other things, is that Ovid gives us, the fantasy, which, throughout time is very much a male fantasy of giving birth to the perfect, ideal woman without all the fuss and bother of impregnating an actual woman. And Ovid shows, I think, how this, and in Ovid, this is clearly cast as an unnatural desire. An unnatural desire because it eventually results in destruction and tragedy once again. So I just want to reiterate here again, my overall point is that Ovid is so influential in the Renaissance because he engages with ideas of creation and recreation that appeal to writers who are themselves engaged in projects of creation and recreation. And these writers include, of course, Christopher Marlowe, William Shakespeare, Mary Shelley, John Milton, who was particularly significant for understanding what Shelley is after in her novel. All of these writers took old stories and made them new again for their own purposes. And this is an intellectual tradition, an ongoing tradition that Shelley herself picks up on and takes and makes her own. She uses this preoccupation with recreation, which is especially evident in Milton, right? Who goes, who just decides, okay, I'm going to rewrite Genesis, as you do. It wasn't good enough when God did it. I have to do it over again to make it better for us. That's Milton. Shelley picks up on that and uses this conception for what was at the time, of course, an entirely new story about the blurred boundaries between nature, the human, and the artistic. It's a story that I read. I know Frankenstein is a scientist, but I read him in the Ovidian tradition as an artist. An artist who is a scientist who works with human bodies, as it were, and who creates his own human being. But here's the really significant difference between the story of Pygmalion and the story of Frankenstein. Whereas Pygmalion falls in love, quite narcissistically, I think, with his own creation, Frankenstein rejects his creation, right? And as Lisa has already gone over, he hates it with enormous disgust and contempt. And so kind of what is at the heart of these stories is very much emotion and emotional affect and emotional responses to the act of creation or the act of recreation. I don't have any kind of answers to this. I just kind of want to point this out as a topic we might explore more in discussion later. Because when we're considering Shelley's legacy, one important aspect of that legacy is how Shelley encourages us to think about metamorphosis, i.e., the changing of shapes, the recreation of material. She challenges us to think about metamorphosis as essentially the heart of what artists do. That it is the artistic project par excellence to recreate. And it's also a risky process. It's a process that at its best challenges us to look beyond what we think we know, right? And that can be a process that is deeply frightening and can be fatal, and is often fatal to artists in Ovid's work, like with Orpheus, for example, who gets ripped limb from limb. That's really all I have for you at the moment, but I'm hoping that by kind of bringing up this topic of Ovid and metamorphosis, I've given you some ideas to think about for our discussion later. Thanks very much for your attention.
So we've had a lot of talk about sympathy and repetition of certain stories that kind of come over and over again today, both in Moira Gatens' talk this morning, of course, and then in Lisa and Jenny's presentations just now. And the monster in Mary Shelley's book has inspired countless opportunities for sympathy, recognition, and identification. The transgender theorist Susan Stryker writes in her article, very, very nicely entitled, "My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix." She says that, like the monster, I am too often perceived as less than fully human due to the means of my embodiment. Like the monsters as well, my exclusion from human community fuels a deep and abiding rage in me that, like the monster, direct against the conditions in which I must struggle to exist. So Stryker recognizes that she's not the only transgender woman who recognizes herself in the monster. And she's actually not the only woman either. Numerous feminist readers from lots of different backgrounds, I mean, Moira Gatens is one of them, and another famous name is Mary Daly, recognize the monster's position as less than human and find inspiration and sympathy in the monster's critique of his scientific and social objectification and otherization, or maybe what we could call monstrification, but also his critique of powerlessness and lack of agency, and his critique of Victor Frankenstein's desire to bend nature according to his own needs, or maybe man's desire to bend nature according to his own needs. Women have, according to feminist theorists like the monster, been seen as inferior and a mere shadow or opposite of men. And indeed, the Greek philosopher Aristotle famously said that woman is the first monster of nature. Women are a monstrously different reflection of men. And I mean, one very interesting example of this is the fact that, you know, the quote that Lisa gave us before about how one is not born a woman, one is not born a monster but becomes a monster, is also reiterated in the famous feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir's book on the second sex, with one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. So Frankenstein calls the monster my own vampire, my own spirit set loose from the grave. And this is one of his major concerns throughout the novel. The monster is his responsibility, or an image of him, or his knowledge and accomplishment, and it thus reflects badly on him as a man. The feminist theorists who argue that the monster is like a woman tend to point out that Mary Shelley's mother was the famous Mary Wollstonecraft, who often has been said to be one of the very first feminists. She was writing during the time of the French Revolution, where a lot of men were calling for a universal set of rights of man, and a few opinionated women, including Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges, produced similar kind of vindications of the rights of women at this time. And they critiqued women's subordinate position and the fact that women were somehow not given these same rights of man. Part of the monster's monstrosity is indeed the fact that he dares to question or critique his difference from other men. Why should he be considered inferior and monstrous when other men are not? And he fights against his subordination. And feminists even today are, of course, to some extent considered somewhat monstrous in popular literature and culture. They're represented as unfeminine, as unattractive or disruptive. I mean, there's lots of images that come along when you say the word feminist. But the disruptive acts of Frankenstein's monster is not the only thing that makes him appear monstrous, and also not the only thing that makes him relatable to women. It is also the unnaturalness or uncanniness of his very existence. The fact that he lives at all is to some extent terrifying.
He is a creation, the physical manifestation of man's ability to create new life. And this is where I would like to turn to one of the wonderful art pieces in Patricia Piccinini's exhibition. And now this is flickering and doing weird things. Okay, yes, I managed. Speaking of like man's interaction with machinery and technology, clearly not my best side. So women's bodies alongside women's wombs have been presented as somewhat uncanny and monstrous throughout the history of Western thought. And the fact that they can create kind of new life is a terrifying thing in itself. And to an extent, the fact that these new lives that come out of the women, it's not just like they're reproducing themselves, they're actually creating something somewhat different and somewhat new and somewhat individual. They're not merely a reflection or copy of the body they spring from, but something resembling their original, although at the same time separate and new. Moira talked about Hume's concentric circles this morning, and I know some of you weren't there. It's this kind of idea that we feel most sympathy for the creatures that are most like us, and less sympathy the further removed they are. Patricia Piccinini's Kindred, which is one of my absolute favorites of this exhibition, shows a mother with 2 children. She herself is some form of orangutan mother, but she's more human-looking than most orangutans. And her children look more human still, one more than the other. If you look closely, one of the children looks almost exactly like a human baby, whereas the other is somewhere in between her kind of human-like orangutan features and a human baby. And of course, our children tend to be similar to us, but they're also somewhat different. And one of these children here is more different than the other, but you don't see any kind of sense of this difference in this mother. You just see care, love, and empathy. And I think this is one of the things that this exhibition really shows us and teaches us. It teaches us that care goes between divides of similarity and difference. It can exist on all these different complicated planes. And the orangutan mother has the ability to love and care for both of these children. And I think that kind of teaches us to an extent to look beyond simple boundaries of similarity and difference, and kind of turns our sense of maybe sympathy or the sense of ourself in another as something more like empathy, something that actually recognizing that the other is slightly different, but still feeling the same amount of care and love. We focus on the similarities rather than the differences, and I think, to an extent, this is what Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's novel fails to do. In the end of the novel, it becomes clear that Frankenstein, to an extent, I mean, at least from my reading of this novel, and obviously everyone has their own reading of this novel, but I think Frankenstein stands out like the bigger moral monster than the monster himself in the book. And I think this is partly because he lacks this ability to look beyond the differences and to see the sameness within his monster. And he lacks the ability to care, love, and empathize even with his own creation or child. And Moira Gatens mentioned briefly this morning that Frankenstein cuts out the mother or the maternal element in the creation process. And I think, to an extent, this actually comes out in this inability to love and to empathize and to care. If you want to make the maternal principle into a principle of care. For Frankenstein, the act of creation finishes when the creature's body achieves animation, but Shelley makes it very clear that creation and parenthood should be an ongoing process of empathy, responsibility, and care. As Jenny was just saying, it's not an act of creation. It's a continual act of recreation, and it's a continual act of finding the similarities within the differences and to care. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth Stevens, and my interests are on the intersection between art and sciences, so being invited to talk about both Frankenstein and Patricia Piccinini's work is right up my alley. Let me just rest that there. Okay, so I want to start by inviting you to enjoy these two images of these wonderful pieces that you can see in the Curious Affection exhibition, because the images themselves are a form of invitation. What they represent is a moment of encounter between a human child, in this case, and a different form of life. But if you look at them, they're not an encounter. They're very touching encounters in one sense, literally as well as metaphorically. There's actual touching going on. But they're also the moment just poised before touch, especially on the left-hand side. And they're moments that are filled with a kind of potentiality of the relationship that encounter might give rise to. But they're fraught with ambiguity at the same time. They're not without a frisson of danger or risk or vulnerability as well. So I want to take these images, which are themselves a kind of invitation, and to invite you to think about those in relation to another kind of encounter as well, which Patricia Piccinini's work and also Frankenstein as a novel are often considered in relation to, and that's the encounter between the arts and the sciences. The cultural theorist Margaret Shildrick has said that to come into contact with a monster is to have an encounter with the strange. She asks, how do we respond ethically and emotionally to something that seems strange to us or even possibly scary? Now, every age invents its own monsters. Lisa showed us some images of he who shall not be named, who may be one of the monsters of our own period. But the monster of Frankenstein the novel, is a monster of a new sort at the beginning of the 19th century. Frankenstein's creature, the creature that the scientist Frankenstein creates, is one of the first monsters who is invented in a scientific laboratory. He's one of the first monsters who's an invention of modern science. He's the fulfillment of Frankenstein's obsessive and all-consuming quest to control and to master the secrets of life. Now, here's how Mary Shelley describes the moment in which Frankenstein's unhallowed arts, as she calls them, comes to fruition. She writes, "It was a dreary night in November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that amounted almost to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. By the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs." Now, in describing this scene and infusing a spark of life into Frankenstein's creature, Shelley was famously inspired by the experiments in galvanic reanimation of human bodies that had been undertaken in the last couple of decades of the 18th century, and Moira talked about those a little bit in her lecture today, and the word galvanism comes from Luigi Galvani, who conducted the first of these experiments. But more particularly and more contemporaneous with her own work, she's often said to be inspired by the work of the Scottish chemist and mechanic Andrew Ewer, and he's often said to be the person who inspired the character of Frankenstein. Now, Ewer was very well known in the early 19th century. He was a kind of public figure, And his most famous experiment took place in 1818. It's the same year that Frankenstein is published in. And this is how he describes his most famous experiment in galvanic reanimation. He says that before a large audience of scientific gentlemen, he attached conducting rods of a large battery to the body of a recently executed criminal. And he says, first of all, he attached the rods to the back, and then the body began to violently convulse. Then he attached the rods to the diaphragm, and the body began to laboriously breathe. When the conducting rods were attached to the dead man's face, and this was the last experiment he conducted, Ewell writes that the face demonstrated rage, horror, despair, anguish, and ghastly smiles. And then the dead man's eyes opened. Seeing this, Ewell writes, several of the spectators were forced to flee the room from terror or sickness, and one gentleman fainted. Now, you can see how closely the scene in Frankenstein recalls the scene in Ewell's report here, but in fact, it's a curious thing to note that Ewell's report is actually published after Frankenstein. So I invite you to think about whether the arts are influencing the sciences there or the other way around. In any case, Frankenstein has a similar response to the creature that he's created that the scientists did to the reanimation of the corpse as animated by Andrew Ewell. And when Frankenstein sees his creature comes to life, its eyes open, dull and yellow, he writes, "A breathless horror and disgust filled my heart." Now, Frankenstein, the scientist, has been driven to master the secrets of life, but the tragedy of Frankenstein, the scientist, is that the life that he has created, the creature that he has brought to life, has a will and agency of his own, and he will use this, as Shelley the novelist reminds us. This is what he discovers in the moment of horror with the creature that he has created, that in fact that creature has agency, it has a will of its own. But it's important to remember, and Moira talked about this in her lecture this morning, that the story of Frankenstein, the character, is not the same as the story of Frankenstein, the novel, written by Shelley, the woman. So this touches on some of the themes that Karin was just talking about. Frankenstein has no sympathy at all for the creature that he's created, but Shelley does. She has much more sympathy for the monster that Frankenstein has made. And the book makes it very clear that Frankenstein, the character, is treating the creature that he's created awfully. The creature, he abandons him for one thing and leaves him alone for years, completely helpless in the world. And then when the creature's single request is that Frankenstein should make him a mate, Frankenstein says that he will do it so that at least the creature has some companionship. And then at the final moment, when he has created a mate for his creature, he rips it into pieces and refuses to go ahead with the experiment. In this encounter, we might ask, who is the monster? Is it the creature? Is it Frankenstein? This is one of the questions of the novel. The question of the duty of care in the production or manipulation of life and to the products of scientific experimentation it's produced is at the heart of the novel of Frankenstein. And we might say that this question is in fact more pressing than ever at the start of the 21st century, when there are ranges when contemporary science allows us to re-engineer life to a degree unimaginable in Mary Shelley's epoch. Some of the products of contemporary scientific animation, like Dolly the cloned sheep, for instance, look cute, and so they get treated in one kind of way. But there are other very famous examples of contemporary scientific experimentation that are more aesthetically challenging, and so get treated in a very different way. And I'm thinking here particularly of the hairless laboratory mouse with a human ear, tissue engineered on its back. That's the first, in fact, example of successful tissue engineering that was released 15 years or so ago. Images of this mouse were circulated around the world, and absolutely every newspaper that carried images of the ear mouse, as it was called, described it as Frankensteinian. Now, it's no coincidence that images of the mouse with an ear on its back have also found its way into Patricia Piccinini's work as well, although those images aren't in this particular exhibition. Now, it's art that provides a place to pose questions about the role of science in shaping or changing the possibilities of life. And it's also art that reminds us that life itself has a way of escaping attempts to control or contain this. And it does this not by explaining the science. Shelley says almost nothing about how Frankenstein actually bestows life on his creature. Instead, it draws attention to the importance, for instance, of aesthetics in shaping our ethical relationships. Characters in the Frankenstein novel are terrified of the creature because they find it so ugly, and it's the brutality of these encounters that drive the creature to its murderous rage. Having been given life and then abandoned, it will take life. So it's art that can provide us with a language or an interpretive framework to navigate encounters with different forms of life, like we see here, and to stay in the moment of this strange encounter, to experience all the ambiguity of the emotions and the possibilities to which a scene like this gives rise. It's worth remembering that the word for monster derives from the words to warn or to show. We get the word demonstrate from this, for instance. A book like Frankenstein and these works by Patricia Piccinini also warn us, remind us of something else. The monsters we create, like the monsters that are being created here, are not simply the objects of our gaze. They also might be staring back at us, sometimes with things that aren't actually eyes. And as Karin's talk reminded us, it may be we who are the monsters. Thank you.
So I was 27 when I first read Frankenstein. I was in Milan. It was on our first trip to Europe after I'd finished art school, and I hadn't made any of this work. I didn't have anything to read, so we went out one night and I spent some money on a book, which was actually a big deal then. And the only thing that I could possibly read in English was Frankenstein, because everything else was like one of those, airport novels. I can't believe that half a lifetime later, 26 years later, I'm here in this room with you guys and these amazing women talking about this novel. It's amazing how life is, isn't it? Reading through the night, and I could never have pictured this moment. So it's quite an honour and a big deal for me to be here to talk about this book with you guys. So thank you for joining me and to talk about this amazing novel. And when I first read it, I really didn't know what to expect, it was really when I was really so far from the Frankenstein of popular culture. I think I expected the book to be about hubris, about the dangers of playing God through technology. But what I found was very different. For me, at least, that worked.
Just had to hit it.
It was like really quite distracting. It was like, for me at least, the book is about bad parenting. Maybe that's just me. That's how I see things in the world. But that's how people do comment on it, and maybe, I see things in a very familial way. At a very sort of basic level, and I think that's what the book brought out in me. But it was a story about responsibility and what happens when we refuse to take responsibility for that which we create. And this is an idea that I hold central to in my practice to this day, and it came from this book. One of my earliest works is Lump, and this explored the idea of genetically modified children whose modification guaranteed them perfect health and intelligence in exchange for a grotesque physiognomy. So I made this child myself out of pig skin. I went to a pig farmer and I chose a pig. He killed it for me, which was a little bit traumatic. And he flayed it and threw me the skin, and I caught it. And then I brought it home with all the meat, and we ate the meat. But I came home with the flayed skin, and I built this creature myself with my own hands. And this is the only sculpture I've ever made. Since then, I've worked with professionals because I infected my fingernails. I cut them really tight so that when I did the sewing, I wouldn't get stuff underneath them, but they were so tight that the skin was exposed and I infected them. So ever since then, I said to Peter, I can't do this. I have to work with people who know what they're doing. And so I eventually set up a studio. But this is my perfect child. And my perfect child is incredibly cerebral and intelligent because I love intelligent people. And it doesn't move around very much because I like to control things. And I made it, and I was drawing in the Museum of Pathology, and I was hanging around with people who made these pots. That's what they're called, formaldehyde exhibits for medical students. And I put it in the formaldehyde, and it's still there. It's pristine. It's exactly how I made him or her. Or it doesn't matter. It doesn't have a gender. At that point, it didn't have gender. So lump is perhaps my most monstrous creation, but in my work, we see it being embraced. So in the gallery, there's a picture of Sophie Lee hugging my baby. While that was kind of a parody of medical advertising, it's also part of my own very natural empathy towards the creature. I mean, I did make it. I mean, I made it. I have to love it, even if it's not exactly human. That's how I kind of see things. So Victor Frankenstein wasn't a very likable man, a protagonist. His desire to make his creature comes out of an arrogance and from a sort of disengaged intellectual curiosity rather than any real interest in the creature itself. And he rejects the creature immediately with a kind of melodramatic vitriol. And I never really understood just what made him so upset. Like, what could have possibly have been so bad about this guy? What could have been so terrible? And Frankenstein always refers to him as the monster, or some variation on it, like the fiend, the wreck, or whatever, the wretch. But I prefer creature, and that's how I'll refer to him, which suggests creation rather than monstrosity. So the creature doesn't reproduce the perfect or Vitruvian man, the idea of perfection, and therefore he's an abomination to Frankenstein. Basically, he's different. And Frankenstein is so upset by that he rejects him immediately. And there's very little in the book to suggest why Frankenstein does this and that any justification for this reaction. And while the creature is physically different and not traditionally beautiful, he is both insightful and eloquent. He is emotional, and to start with at least, he's fair-minded. While Frankenstein refuses absolutely to connect with his creature, I have more faith in those who meet my creatures. The young family, for example, is built entirely on the empathy between the viewer and the creature. She has been created to serve us. But how do we feel when we're confronted by her obvious sentience? Can we look beyond the difference and see the connection between ourselves and her family? And when we do that, can we think about the ultimate question? Would we sacrifice one of her children to save our own? Frankenstein is a classic patriarch, and he can't deal with his son that does not exactly reproduce him. And it is this rejection, this failure to love and accept, or to even take responsibility for his creation, that is at the heart of the tragedy in the novel. As we go forward into the world, this world where we really can create new life, the question of whether we can love the failures of our actions as well as the successes is at the core of my practice. And this is a question that I return to often in my works, such as The Long-Awaited or Doubting Thomas, where we see children engaged with these strange, apparently malformed organisms in ways that are empathetic, open-minded, and curious rather than recoiling in horror, as Frankenstein does. And I guess this is the real distinction between my own work and Shelley's. While she's writing the original dystopic science fiction novel, I'm trying to find some optimism. What happens if we do actually learn from Frankenstein's mistake? I'm interested in the journey that the viewer might take from the initial discomfort to acceptance. That's my aim for my work. That the viewer feels an emotion that we actually don't even have a name for now. And that emotion is the feeling that you get when you become aware in yourself that you're warming to something that you were originally averse to. Like you can feel yourself opening up. That's what I would like people to get out of my work. Doesn't always happen, but that's what I aim for. That's why I make work, for those transformative moments. The sort of moments that I had in that Milanese cheap hotel without a bathroom. That moment that I had at night. Another idea that I work a lot with that I found in Frankenstein is the idea of exploring both technology and difference through relationships. The idea of relationships is another central structure in Shelley's book. The creature wants a relationship with another being. He's not really fussy either. He would be happy to have a relationship with his father, but his father rejects him. So he goes off into the world and attempts to construct relationships with the people he finds there. But on the whole, he's rejected by everyone, except momentarily by a blind man. And in the work like The Welcome Guest, or The Bond, and this is a particularly good incarnation of The Welcome Guest that I made for a show in Turkey, where we built this whole landscape. We see an open-eyed acceptance of the otherness of these creatures by their human companions. And then it is the viewer that is placed in the position of having to decide whether they feel comfortable with this closeness, whether they see the relationship as uplifting or disturbing. I don't know about you, but when my kids even come close to a dog they don't know, I'm anxious. Like if I don't know the dog, I'm thinking, is it going to be okay? Like in the park. And that dog's natural, whereas this creature's not natural. It's completely artificial. It's completely man-made. That's a big thing, right? How close do we want our children, my children, your children, to be connected to something that's not natural? She's fine. She's enamored. She loves him. And he loves her back. But how do we feel? And I think this points to a kind of unease we have with technology. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, because I'm actually quite interested in technology and what it can bring us. But it's something that is in our world that I'm trying to explore. When it's clear that the creature cannot find love in a human world, the creature returns to its father and asks him to make him a mate. And initially Frankenstein accepts, but then he reneges, he refuses, and again it's really hard to understand why. Like, he's got no compassion, like no empathy. He's really quite a creep. Except for the feeling that he just can't stand the creature's difference. And I think it's just that simple, his otherness. He's really, really that prejudiced and closed. The tragedy of violence that ensures does nobody any credit, but it seems obvious how much of it could have been avoided with some paternal compassion. However, perhaps part of Frankenstein's refusal might come from his understanding that with a mate would come a degree of independence, even the possibility to procreate and establish a community of some sort. A mate would grant the creature some liberty, and Frankenstein can't accept this at all. This dynamic is something that I return to often in my work. And the couple, which is this work, is perhaps the most explicit call back to Shelley's creature. The pair of creatures embracing in their caravan evoke both a shared isolation and the freedom of movement. That they're mobile, they're in a caravan. And the pair are in the process of creating a new family on their own terms. Yes, they have their mate. And not only do they have their mate, but they have actually a very beautiful relationship. They have a relationship where the male is allowed to rest on the female's shoulder. And she is the vigilant one. It's a beautiful dynamic, one that's kind of missing in our culture. And I defy you to find another picture in our contemporary world where a man rests on a woman's shoulder. It just doesn't exist. I think this is what makes Frankenstein such a lasting novel. It's not prescient as much as timeless, in that it's about concepts that are human and consistent. Relationships, love, rejection, and responsibility. And I'm by no means an expert on Frankenstein, although after today I think I am a lot more informed. But I'm a very enthusiastic amateur. And my ears prick up whenever I hear anything about the novel. And with the bicentenary approaching, there have been some pretty fascinating articles and podcasts that have really expanded my understanding of the novel and reinforced my conviction that this is a novel that remains relevant. For example, I always knew that the book was written as a dare while Mary Shelley was holidaying by Lake Geneva with Shelley and Byron. What I didn't know was that this holiday occurred in 1816, also known as the year without summer. And that was a period of global climate catastrophe, precipitated by a massive eruption of Mount Tambor in 1815. And so that whole year, the skies were filled with ash and the crops failed. It was an unseasonably cold summer of dark, ashy skies that forced Shelley and her friends, who were in a beautiful place, they forced them indoors. And it spurred them to write these horror stories instead of lazing around by the lake. But around them, a widespread famine resulted from this period of climate change. So people were starving and they were leaving the farms. And hundreds of thousands of these refugees were just poured into the cities across Europe in search for food. And the Swiss people around the Shelleys and Byron that were serving them, well, they didn't really take too kindly to these unfortunates, and they spurned them away, just like the monster is in Shelley's book. And it's interesting to see the novel in the context of a climate disaster. And my own work is very much a response to the questioning of our relationship to the environment within the context of the Anthropocene. So in a work like The Field, so The Field is that big, all those 3,000 flowers. Have people seen the show? So the big white field of 3,000 flowers. Well, that's my response. I'll talk about it. So these expansive white plants that greet the viewer when they enter the final gallery of GOMA. So I'm trying to shift our idea of nature and the environment. I'm looking for a way to talk about nature that doesn't put it in opposition to human culture, but at the same time doesn't simply subsume it within technology. So how can we think about nature and fecundity in a way that puts people within it rather than above it? So those flowers are like, well, they suggest agriculture. They suggest that they're cultivated. They're obviously artificial. They're the shape and size of organs, so they could possibly bring good things to us, replacement organs. My mother died of cancer, so I'm really interested in that. But at the same time, they're not natural, but they're quite beautiful. Like when you go in and you're just confronted by this almost sublime sight, you think, wow, that's really beautiful, but it's not natural. It's something else. So I'm trying to talk about, open up a space around our idea of the environment. And we also have our own refugee crisis, but this time it's very much of our own making. The same sort of demonization of the other that Shelley saw from her window as the vagrants walked by begging for food. And then she brought into her concept of the monster, the shunned other, feels very contemporary to me. It was against this backdrop of misanthropy and gloom that Shelley wrote Frankenstein. She was also an abolitionist, and so it's easy to see the creature as reflecting the plight of the displaced peasants who clogged the roads around her, or even the situation of the slaves in the English sugar plantations in the West Indies. So Mary also refused to eat sugar out of sympathy for the slaves. So slaves created sugar. They made her class wealthy, her country gloriously powerful, and she refused to eat sugar, which is amazing, isn't it? And I think, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could refuse to eat palm oil, which is a similar thing, right? Palm oil is destroying the forests. It's making a certain sector of our society very wealthy and privileged. Anyway, I don't think it's just my anachronistic imagination that sees Shelley's sympathy lying more closely with the creature, and thus by extension the peasants or the slave others, who would have also been considered subhumans. And it's no accident that the creature, despite being universally reviled, speaks so articulately. Despite his lack of education, you can never doubt his intelligence. In the works like The Carrier or The Big Mother, I'm interested in exploring the sort of power relationships that we're likely to have with the creatures we create in our future. Will we overlook their sentience and cast them as slaves, as Frankenstein does with his creature? Does their non-humanity exclude them from the rights and the sorts of relationships that this suggests? Shelley's creature is by no means perfect. By the end of the novel, he has killed several people, some out of sheer spite. The creature is rejected and brutalized and never shown love, and in the end, he becomes brutal and hateful himself. That's the real sadness of the novel, that through lack of love and acceptance, the creature's potential is destroyed and his possibility is degraded into violence and hate. And for me, I'm interested in the other side of the coin. But I'm always aware that there needs to be a bit of darkness in the work. And in my works, the strangeness of the physiognomy goes way beyond what we find in nature. This is Heartwood. It's intense even for me, and I made it. So in Heartwood, for example, and in many of my recent works, we see the blending of objects and humans to create a body that is really amorphous. The opportunities I imagine cannot exist in the realm of the conventionally beautiful. So there's nothing to be gained in simply loving the cute. We must learn to love that which confronts us and that which possibly threatens us. So this work is about a celebration of life, but no life in particular. It's about unbridled growth. It's about blending. It's about bringing things together. Here we have these kind of everyday, but very beautiful and stylish motorcycle boots that quote the quotidian. And up from them are these roots, these tripod, motor-inspired roots. And from that emerges the pain body of Saint Sebastian, this growth of elbows. It doesn't have one head, it's got three, and these heads are not in the right spot. They've become the fruit of this tree. In fact, it's not a machine, it's not an animal, it's something else, it's some kind of moving plant. And this is all affirmed by real nature. The glorious wedge-tailed eagle that has found and made her life atop this work. I love it. I think it's my best work. And I know it's quite challenging. So, whether it's Shelley's intention or my own prejudice, there's a story to be found in Frankenstein that is both empathetic and progressive. It's a story about how we treat the other creatures around us, and an argument that sentience is not limited to people that are like us. And so it remains fertile ground to this day. Thanks.
I want to open this discussion by making an utterly banal observation. Mary Shelley is a woman artist, and Patricia Piccinini is a woman artist, and we have an all-female panel. And is it a reason to clap? I'm not sure if it is or it's not, but I think it's remarkable, and I think it is kind of both banal and worth remarking on. And one of the reasons I think it's worth remarking on, and I'm going to ask both Lisa and Jenny to respond to this, I think that at the centre of the novel Frankenstein is this kind of absent centre, which is the sexual relation. And once it's raised, that's when all hell breaks loose. You know, once Frankenstein's creature wants an Eve, you know, he wants his creator to give him an Eve, that's when, you know, Frankenstein begins making her, but he rips her to pieces, and that's when Frankenstein completely loses it, and they then are locked in this combat that you know has to end in the death of one of them and possibly both of them, and it does in fact end in the death of both of them. So what's going on here? Like, why is there at the centre of this novel written by a woman, a young woman, who is the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, author of Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and of William Godwin, you know, author of political treatises talking about how we should have just institutions to make just societies. What is going on? And I'm asking Lisa and Jenny partly because, Lisa, you spoke about this monstrous sexuality, and Jenny, because you spoke about sexual difference being at the heart of the Ovidian story of Pygmalion. So can I pass that to you too, to open discussion on this question of the sort of absent centre of sexual difference?
Do you want to start? Yeah, I think I have to turn this on. Can you guys hear me better now? Yeah. You're right, it's a turning point. What to say? I mean, I think that the question of, you know, monstrous reproduction, monstrous family, monstrous pleasure, sexuality, community, etc., does represent the limits of the novel and the limits of sympathy in the novel. So I think that Mary Shelley is ambivalent about these questions, and I think that she, in the end, has to make a call, and that the monster the creature's rights can't go that far. I think she's on Victor's side at that moment. I think Victor's rationale it works for her. But I think the novel raises these questions in ways that are, you know, extremely radical and troubling. Well, I think closes down. That's my read. I think it's arguable too.
I was trying to think about it, actually. I remember reading, I think it might have been Stephen King some years ago, a long time ago actually, writing about Frankenstein and saying, you know, why is Frankenstein worried about a female monster getting pregnant? If he can make a female creature, he could make her sterile. You know, if he really was that worried about it, you know. But just to bracket that, I mean, that's just one observation. I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking about the book in relation to Milton, actually, and I think this kind of goes back to the idea of Genesis, right? I mean, in many ways, Frankenstein is sort of the anti-Genesis, you know, insofar as the creature identifies with Satan. He's sort of a perverted version of Adam. And so where Adam has it easy, okay, he doesn't really, of course, but relatively speaking, I suppose he does. Adam's request to God for a mate is represented is very straightforward. It's no big deal. God in fact, has anticipated this request and has just been waiting for Adam to kind of come up with it. And he's like, don't worry about it. Next time you wake up, there'll be a female there. Of course, she ends up loving herself initially rather than Adam, but she learns the error of her ways. But Satan has no mate apart from, and this is where we get a bit more Ovidian, at least in Paradise Lost, Satan's mate is sin, who is his own daughter. His first encounter with sin is, of course, in heaven when he conceives the idea of rebelling against God, and he sees, and then she appears in a way that is completely, is given us in much the same way as the way Athena comes from the brain of Zeus. So it's another instance of parthenogenesis, the instance of parthenogenesis, and he has sex with her immediately. So he both gives birth to her, and then he immediately has sex with her, and they give birth jointly to death. But interestingly here, is sin, in that moment of conception of death, she becomes a monster. She becomes Scylla. Effectively, her lower parts turn into ravenous dogs that constantly eat her. So I think insofar, I do think, we can appeal to Shelley's biography for ways in which, sex is problematic for her, but we can also look to her kind of intellectual and literary predecessors. So insofar as she's modeling herself to a large degree on Milton's epic, I think we're also seeing here an engagement with monstrosity in terms of sin and just kind of a sense that, again, I think, as Lisa said, this is a step too far.
But also, I suppose we should remind ourselves that the Genesis story, it's when Eve comes along that Adam falls.
That trouble comes about,
and that's when we have knowledge, and we have knowledge of good and evil, and we have knowledge of sin, and a self-reflective sexuality.
Yeah.
A kind of. Actually, I wonder if I could. I just wanted to ask Patricia. Before moving to Karin, your work is so much about birth and fecundity, as you've said in various places. But leaving aside the couple, which I think is very much your response to Mary Shelley, there aren't a lot of dads around. So the young family. There doesn't appear to be a father, and so if we think of Frankenstein as bypassing the female principle and using science to create a new being, what do you think in terms of this? Again, I'm pushing on this sort of sexual relation.
Yeah, it's great you pointed it out because I'd never realised that. Yeah, as soon as the idea of creating a woman who could reproduce, it's over. That couldn't possibly happen. So why aren't there many dads?
Well, not why aren't there many dads, but what do you think that's right?
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
It's a really good point actually, and I was aware of it. Well, there's two things. First of all, there's the eagle eggmen in the grotto, and they're the ones with the Charles Lebrun faces, which I think you were talking about the similar thing this morning. Yeah.
I actually had some slides from him.
Oh, right. Yeah, like if you looked like a pig, you were greedy. If you looked like a donkey, you were asinine or whatever. And there they are, and their whole bodies have moulded to the task of husbanding these eggs, and like their boots have become parts of their bodies. They're so engrossed in this serious task. And they are the masculine element of the process of reproduction. And I felt, they were the last thing I made for the show because I felt it needed it. In fact, I was quite late in making them, and that was a bit of an issue, but they had to be there. But having said that, I don't focus a lot on the male aspect of this very much, and that is because I'm very interested in looking at the specificities of bodies, and I'm interested in my body because I have one, and my body, even if I don't have to reproduce, I don't think it's imperative that women do it. I think it's not a good idea all the time, to be honest, actually. But it is a body that is constantly being affected by that process. Like your body changes, your mind changes, and I think that's a good thing and a beautiful thing, and I try and valorize it in my work. And also I try and valorize the role of maternity as well, because even though there are very cliched images, I don't think generally nurturing or is a role, or caring is a role that is valorised in our society, and I think that's a problem.
And if I may say so, I think you managed to show the extraordinariness of the fecundity of a feminine body without making it monstrous. Yeah. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do. So if people saw the seedling, I think the seedling's an amazing representation of that.
I think you're absolutely right, Moira, and I've tried to represent the fecundity of the female body without having to say that every female body must conform to this, and this is the only female body that has value. Because if I was saying that, that's too essentialist, and I don't want to talk for everyone, but I want to have that idea out there in a kind of a ambiguous way, but it's there. The whole work is steeped in it, that feeling of it. And actually, you actually, Moira, talked about it today. It's about creation. Yeah. Yeah. It's the ultimate thing. That's what the show's about.
Yes,
you know?
Absolutely.
That's really what it, and to me, that is absolutely sanguine, optimistic.
Yes.
It's something that makes life valuable.
Yeah. Karin, what were you going to say?
Oh, I just wanted to jump in there earlier because, we're talking about the thing that makes the production of a female partner so terrifying. And I think it comes to the heart of the actual conundrum of the novel, the idea of the subordination of nature or and the control of nature. If you were to create a creature that has the ability to reproduce, then you lose all sense of control over this nature. I mean, it's practically taking it one step further in the process that Frankenstein has already begun. Yeah. And I think this is one of the things that has made the feminine so terrifying, certainly in medicine from the time when Mary Shelley was writing. The idea that you couldn't quite control it, that it did constantly change, that it did constantly produce new little sort of seedlings, so to speak, and you can't be in full control.
Elizabeth, I wonder if we could finish with a comment from you that's sort of picking up some of this, because you mentioned how difficult the relationship between art and science is, and I think that it's arguable that art can get out of one's control as well, just like science can. And there's this kind of experiment, hypothesis that both art and science put forward. And there's always a kind of danger that you'll lose control of what it is that you're making. I wonder if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, well, Patricia probably has an experience of that when she hears people talk about her work. You probably have the experience of feeling like it's going into the world and making meanings that you had, No, expectation, that people would have. And when we looked at all those images that Lisa showed of, the long history of Frankenstein in popular culture, that's completely beyond anything that she would have ever imagined. But I think in relation to the question about, gender and reproduction that people were just talking about, I think you see something else, less so in Frankenstein, but more particularly in Patricia's work, where one of the, you asked the question, Moira, about the, the representations of female bodies, but when I look at those, the pieces that you've produced, Patricia, I'm not so sure of the gender of a lot of those. Some of the images that you can see are gendered in particular ways, but for me, the gender here, for instance, so for me, one of the ways that art can go somewhere new, that's very timely as well, at the start of the 21st century, is that our expectations of certain characteristics, corresponding with certain particular kinds of biological gender, I think are very challenged by some of these pieces as well.
A really interesting point. Thank you. I think I'm getting the signal to open up to the audience. You've been terribly patient, and I'm sure people particularly would love to ask Patricia questions about her work, but any person sitting in front of you here is available to respond to any questions that you may have. Yes?
I'm just intrigued that this 200 years ago.
I think you might need a mic.
Can I just ask people to...
Yeah.
First, what an incredible panel from all of you and incredible work. Thank you. I brought my children just to hear from you. And I'm very grateful for everything you've all done. The thing that's intriguing to me is this was 200 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution really took hold, before the transformation of Earth really began. And she was foreseeing that. And you seem to be foreseeing so much about where my children will be going over the next 50, 100, 200 years. And I'm curious, well, this is about Frankenstein and that history. If you could talk briefly about how you feel you are similar to Shelley in foreseeing what might be coming. She certainly did, and you certainly are.
Well, it's amazing to be put in the same sentence as Mary Shelley to start with. I don't feel like I'm anywhere near what she's done, that's for sure. But yes, I do see that as part of my role, to talk to the viewer about how we see technology changing the way we see ourselves and other animals and our relationship to the environment. And that's not often a topic for art, actually. And I really push it. I really try and still do it. And I guess in some ways it kind of opens me. I'm so sincere about it. Like I had a Q&A here with Year 9 students the other day, and I was saying, yeah, you should tell those guys that are deforesting our forests to just go drown in their palm oil, because I actually feel that way, with the work, I am trying to offer these works up for as a catalyst to talk about things, and together we make meaning. Like art is about meaning making, and it's made with the individual viewer, and they come up to the work with their baggage and history, and I have my baggage and history, my mother and blah, and we together make an idea, and that becomes part of culture. And if it's a transformative moment, and Moira was talking about these moments today, then it gives us agency to actually act. And that's the problem. We're just leaving it up to the experts, these powerful and often quite belligerent men who have just, I don't know, just don't care about our children. I have children the same age as yours. They don't care. Short-term gain. They're Frankensteins.
Could I add something to the foresight of the artist in relation to Shelley in particular? In the scene that I read out where Frankenstein creates, his creature, he's using electricity. He's using galvanic reanimation to spark life into the creature, but Frankenstein himself's working by candlelight. Electricity doesn't exist in the sense that we mean it. And one of the people who talks about the consequences of then the commercial use of electricity in the decades to come is the person I quoted who's actually doing galvanic reanimation experiments, is Andrew Ewer. And one of his most famous books is on the rise of the factory, which is how electricity gets used in the first decades of the 19th century. And he's a champion for the factory. He goes around to Manchester and Birmingham, places like that, and talks about what wholesome environments they are for providing work for young children and how happy and healthy the children are. The control of life through electricity doesn't happen through galvanic reanimation. It happens through the Industrial Revolution. And you can see questions about the control of life through early industrialism in Shelley's book, although I don't think it's in her mind, it's not on the horizon at that point. So there are other ways, I think, in which the novel's very prescient.
I would also want to add a very brief thing to answer your question directly, like in what ways is Patricia like Shelley? I mean, I think she said earlier, one difference is she's more optimistic, and I think that's absolutely right, that the work is optimistic. There's something very depressing about the conclusion to Frankenstein. They both die. We don't know if Frankenstein dies or not, but he says he's going off to die. He says he's going to. He says no. He doesn't say. He says he's going to. But yeah, I mean, I believe him. So. But the point is they try to destroy each other, and certainly Frankenstein dies, and I imagine the creature does too. That's not what we get in Piccinini's work. What we get in her work is an encounter. Where's it going to go? We're not sure. It's ambiguous, it's ambivalent, but it's open in a way that I think Shelley's narrative, whether or not the creature lives, is shut down. I feel it's shut down, and it's quite a negative story. Is there any other?
I'll just make one last comment. I'm sorry.
But can I just see, because I know
not.
time's limited. Is there any other question before we? Okay.
It was simply that we've been coming to GOMA for a decade now since it's opened, and what is amazing about this work and this exhibit is it's transformed what art can be in so many ways. And my son is an artist, and what is so gives me so much gratitude is that you're opening up an entire new language of how we can be artists and engage with the world, which I haven't heard before, and Shelley did that as well. But again, thank you.
No, I think at some point we should all stand up and give Patricia a standing ovation. I agree. I think the work's brilliant. Any other please don't be shy. It's such an opportunity to have the artist present. It's just wonderful.
I'd just like to return to the point you started the discussion with around that denial of the creature having a partner, and also a lot of you use the language of mirroring, doubling, reflection, which is something that's acknowledged throughout a lot of the scholarship around Shelley, and that Frankenstein is denied that opportunity too, because Elizabeth, his bride-to-be, is killed by the creature, by his monstrous double, which I think then returns to that point that there goes the optimism, which isn't, of course, evident in Patricia's work. I just was wondering if you kind of, that doubling there, that same denial, coupled with the fact that in the 1831 edition, Elizabeth goes from being his cousin to a foundling. So there's also those social taboos at play. Maybe they were never to consummate because it was a little bit naughty. So yeah, just your thoughts around that mirrored denial of that sexuality that you raised at the start, if there's anything more to say about that.
Patricia, do you have anything to say to that question?
About the denial of...
About the
denial of the creator
and the mirroring.
denied as well as the creature being denied. So
They're both denied the potential to connect.
even though he's successfully created,
Yeah.
it's his creation that denies him. I just find that tension, and I find that really problematic.
So let's
Sorry,
no.
it's not really a question so much as an observation.
Oh, okay. So I'm trying to get it. So Mary's created a situation where there's no possibility for no connection, at all.
Yeah.
And that is an issue. I think the difference between 200 years ago and now, and the reason why I make my work, I try and be optimistic, is because I feel that if there is no optimism, it's just so everything is so frightening and overwhelming that you just can't act. And so that's why I present connection and the possibility for that, even if it's not the sort of connection that we would have imagined possible or desirable up until quite recently. You're quite good to have brought your sons, because I love my son, but I couldn't drag him here. I absolutely adore him, but he hates this novel. I made him read it in year 6, and he absolutely hates it. And he says to me, it's because they die at the end. And to be a young person today and to be confronted by the potential of this climate disaster, this catastrophic collapse of our environment, I think is really overwhelming. And no wonder they would rather disappear into computer games. No wonder. And this artificial space. And the denial associated with this is intense. And so with my work, even though it's not the kind of stuff that you would normally see in a gallery, that's for sure. It's not about blue squares or, I don't know, beautiful women or whatever. I feel like I have to make this work because there is so much at stake. This is the only thing we can talk about, how we relate to others, how we understand the environment, how technology changes the way we see each other, and how we can go forward together with other animals.
We might have time for one last question. Did you have a question?
We talked a lot about Frankenstein's sort of hatred of his creature and his sympathy or lack thereof. And it's been said maybe that he seems to be entirely lacking in sympathy. But I guess this is especially for Jenny and Lisa. But do you think in some sense his response is born from recognition of himself in the monster?
Shall I go? I don't think that Frankenstein lacks sympathy for his monster. I think that part of the interest of the novel is the equivocation that happens on a couple of very significant occasions between a response of sort of revulsion and horror and sympathy, and then back again. I mean, the problem, that's why I've talked about the limits of sympathy. In the end, I think for Shelley, sympathy does have its limits and it's quite transient. So it can flip on and off. It's like an on-off switch. And that's what happens for Victor at crucial moments in the narrative. So does that connect to what you just said?
I'm not sure.
I'm trying to remember what was the hook of your question. Can you repeat it for me, please?
I guess I wasn't actually myself arguing that he doesn't have sympathy, but it's not just a sympathy or lack thereof, but it's actually maybe an unconscious recognition that his monster is a physical manifestation of his own moral
So
monstrosity.
the doubling thing, yeah.
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 Maybe
Yeah,
it was
I just say yeah.
Well, I'll just add the other myth that I would have liked to talk about if we had time is Narcissus. And that's a story about misrecognition that turns out to be fatal in the end. So Narcissus is the beautiful boy, like Adonis, whom everybody loves, but he is himself immune to love. Until he is cursed. And then he looks at himself, he finally sees himself in a mirror, and he falls in love with the reflection. And this is key because he does not recognize the reflection as himself at first. He does eventually realize it, but at first he just sees this beautiful otherness that he desperately desires. And then he finally, by the time he realizes that this beautiful other self is himself, it's fatal. He dies. And so it's sort of an early version of the doppelganger, you might say. And I think that's is very relevant for understanding Victor Frankenstein's egotistic pursuance. I mean, his desire to create life is effectively a desire to reproduce himself, and he does so. He does so successfully. But then you get, and you could do a whole psychoanalytic reading of this, right? Oh, absolutely, yeah. That it's both attractive and repulsive. And perhaps it's the attraction that makes it so repulsive, if you see what I mean. Does it make sense? Yeah? Okay, cool.
Can I add something there very quickly?
Yes.
Because I think just taking it back to your question before about the doubling, I think that's how the doubling really plays out here. You're talking about how both Frankenstein and the monster, to some extent, the monster really does become a manifestation of Frankenstein himself. And he certainly sees that. And both of them fail to have any kind of reproductive couplings with others outside of that. To an extent, what we get is a very sterile novel. The only kind of production you can have is a reproduction of yourself, or like a mirroring of yourself. They can't move to the point where you're actually reproducing and creating something different from yourself.
And I would add to that, Walton and Frankenstein double each other. And it's such a homosocial relation. At last I found a friend I could love.
And then he dies. But can I? but again, and honestly, this is really, really quick. But I did want to say earlier that I do think there is a tiny, tiny scrap of hope, and it isn't much, and it's sort of a deeply negative thing in a way. But what happens is Walton and Frankenstein fail to convince the sailors to keep sailing on into the north, which will almost certainly be the death of all of them. And so the way I see that is as a resistance to this masculine ideology of conquest, And I think that's the one way in which, Patricia, the novel might speak to that optimism a little bit. It's a tiny thing. But it's that moment of, okay, we're not going to risk our lives in pursuit of something that is frankly ridiculous. We're going to go back home to an ordinary life with wives and perhaps children and so on. And that's, I think, the one small way in which the hope...
That's a fantastic note on which to end.
Yes, it is. Thank you.